Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the podcast, The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian. This is the Reverend David J. Lucy. Say hi, David.
Hi, David.
Haha.
Haha.
And he is the rector of St. Francis Episcopal Church in Great Falls, Virginia. David came to the priesthood from a career in banking, which is relevant today because we're going to be talking about calling, vocation. How do you know if you have a calling? And does everyone have one? We had some good feedback on the first episode, and I just wanted to address a few suggestions we got. One was that we should have a theme song, so we'll work on that. Um, the second was that people would have appreciated a visual since we were talking about how priests dress. So we're working on that too, to present a video of David donning his vestments and explaining what each one means and why it's important to the celebration of Eucharist. And then the third suggestion was to regularize the production schedule so that people would know that the episode was coming out on a particular day. And I'm going to work on that too. I retired from the practice of law, sort of allergic to deadlines, but I will I will try to regularize the production schedule. So on the subject of calling, I guess David, we should open with, if you're comfortable, talking a little bit about how did you know you had a calling?
So I didn't necessarily know I had a calling. I felt I had a calling. And I don't know if my experience is common or not. I'm sure it's not uncommon. Um, so I grew up in a very religious household. I think I told you that last time. And my mother was a Methodist and my father was a Roman Catholic, and going to church was something we did regularly, every week at least, and sometimes more than once a week. So I grew up in two traditions that had um, very, had major commitments to uh, official vocations. I know in the Roman Catholic Church it's often called vocation. Vocation comes from a Latin word vocare, which means call. The same is true for my mother's Methodist side. And, they both have very strong traditions about people being called into offices for God. And I was exposed to that a lot. And I always felt comfortable in the church and always had this image of the church had an important message and an important place in my life and in the lives of the people who were part of those communities. And so, probably when I was in my middle teens, 15, 16, I sensed a calling to ordained ministry. But at the time, I was a little confused about where I belonged. I didn't necessarily fit in the Methodist Church, and I didn't necessarily fit in the Catholic Church. And as a 15 or 16-year-old, I'll, honestly confess that when they tell you to receive the gift of a calling into the holy orders in the Roman Catholic Church also meant that you had to receive the gift of chastity, which, because they would not let their priests marry, meant celibacy. That didn't excite me all that much. And also, I had a very practical father who thought I should become do something in business, do something, what he would have called productive. And so I put things in the back burner
Mhm.
for a long time.
And
Later,
you did take quite a different path, a path that your father would have deemed practical,
right.
going to
So
banking.
everything from instead of majoring in history, which I think I would have really loved as an undergraduate, I majored in economics and took as many history courses as I could. And and my father thought that was very practical. I will tell you, I went to a liberal arts school and they were not teaching econometrics, they were teaching economics, which is how do you think about the distribution of scarce resources, which isn't exactly practical. But while doing that, I won a scholarship from the George F. Baker Trust, which was a nationwide scholarship fund. And
Hmm.
the promise at the end of my undergraduate days, which they helped supplement, was that if I went immediately to a business school, they would pay my tuition. So
Wow.
that influenced my decision to go ahead and go to the George, I can't even remember now. It's at Wake Forest University. It's not the Bakers, but there was a George F. Babcock School of Business down there, and they had a really good general business program. And from there, I went into finance. So, that was what I thought my call was. I thought I'll be a businessman, I'll be a banker, and I'll do that. And it was interesting because at my graduation, my grandparents were there, my mother's parents, and they told my oldest sister that they were surprised I was going to business school because they thought I was going to be a minister. So,
Really?
yeah, she told me that story years later after I was approved for a whole for postulancy and holy orders, and that's another part of the story. So my story is long. It took a while, and as I tell people, when I got the call initially, I spent a lot of time telling God He had a wrong number. So I was trying to put it off, and it was ironic at some level because when I had moved to New York and really had set my sights, because I'd moved from a regional bank in the Atlanta area to what would have been considered a money center bank in New York with a strong um, a presence in the securities industry, uh, which was the Irving Trust Company, which became the Bank of New York. Longer, that's a long story too. I thought that was where I belonged, and my wife and I joined a church up there. So my wife came from the Episcopal Church, and early on in our relationship, we made that a part of our lives. So we went to church together, and when I moved to New York, uh, and after Catherine had moved to New York, we made our spiritual home at St. Bartholomew's Church. You mentioned it in the first episode, which is at Park and 50th Street. And the reason we did that is because Catherine's priest from Atlanta, Georgia, was there. And then they had actually four priests on staff, the rector and three assistants. And one of the assistants ran a course in meditation and how to hear God's voice. And I started taking it, and there were practical parts of it. He just didn't put it up on the board, and we would pray and we would meditate. And he tried to give us a sense of what we might experience if, in fact, God was communicating with us. And so I began to practice that. And I was deeply hungry as a Christian for some sense that God would speak to me. I really hadn't at that point in my life sensed that God had ever really spoken to me directly. People had spoken to me, the Bible spoke to me, the teachings of both the Roman Catholic and the Methodist Church spoke to me, but I had this sense that God hadn't yet chosen to speak to me, and I deeply desired that. And sometimes you should be really careful about what you deeply desire. And one night I was meditating. My wife and I had a very small apartment in New York on West 89th Street, and she had already gone to bed, and I was sitting there in the quiet. And in my period of meditation, I sensed the presence of uh, Jesus with me. And that's a very, I think, Methodist and evangelical statement, but I did. And the sense I had was he was telling me I had a job to do for him. And that was very surprising to me.
Mm.
And I had other experiences in my meditations that went along with that. And so I was now practicing as an Episcopalian. Like you practice law, I was practicing to be an Episcopalian. Someday I might get it right. Yeah, and so I went to see the priest who had been teaching about meditation. And I said, I think I have this sense of calling, and took a long time to really explain to him, well, I've been sort of avoiding this for a long time. Um, and and so there's a process in the Episcopal Church. So callings are personal. All callings are, but not all callings are private. And in fact, if you're being called by God to do something, most often it's about serving your neighbor in some capacity. Therefore, it's not a private office, it's a public office. And church communities should be geared to helping people discern through that. I know in the Diocese of Virginia, they actually do have discernment conferences. And most people would have expected, and a lot of the participants do, go there thinking I've been called to the diaconate or the priesthood, and they're exploring that. But some people go there and say, I think I'm called to do something more for God, but I don't think it's the priesthood or diaconate. I think it's but something more important as a layperson. So people go and explore that. And the Diocese of Virginia has set itself up in order to deal with that. And I think that's a particularly important thing to do, because in the end, I really think all people are called by God to ministry, but not all people are called to ordain to ministry or holy orders, as it's known. And I think people should explore that. I think also, if, whatever your job is, um, I think you will experience greater satisfaction and greater spiritual vitality if the job you're doing is the job that God created you to do.
Mhm.
So, you know, there was a woman in Atlanta. She's a friend of Catherine and mine, and I remember she used to read for fun annual reports. She would read them at night. Her husband, who was also a banker, told me this. He said, I don't read annual reports at night. And she did. And I thought, well, there is somebody who's really called to be a banker, because let me tell you something. I think they write annual reports to make them so boring you will not read them. So anyway, that's part of it. But so many people I knew who went into various professions, uh, they didn't think about those things as callings. Often, sometimes later they did, but often they didn't. And I really think if you are called, the deep hunger of the world. This is a paraphrase of something a Presbyterian minister, Frederick Buechner. He's also a writer and a novelist. Put down is, where your gifts and uh, desires lie to serve the world and feed the deep hunger of the world. That's what your That's your vocation. That's your vocare. So,
So
yeah,
I came across this book, A Sacred Voices Calling by
right.
John Neefsey. It's a 2006 book, but I didn't hear of it until about 10 days ago, when serendipitously a priest friend of mine said, you ought to think about this book. And one of the themes that he explores is career versus calling.
Right.
And it's very easy to measure success in a career. You get more money, you get a bigger title, you get a bigger office, but harder to measure success in a calling. And he talks about the difference between a career and a calling is that the calling intersects not just with what you want and who you are, but um, to whom do you belong?
Right.
Whose situation, whose plight calls out your compassion to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do with your life? And it's occurred to me as I've heard parts of your story of your calling that, you made a considerable sacrifice. You could have had material success, virtually unlimited nature, but you deliberately chose to do something else. And I wonder what that process was like.
So, one of the really difficult things to do is after you've been married for about a year, and your wife married a commercial banker, and you're living in New York, and you're um, thinking that you're looking at a challenging career that also had monetary benefits, um, and then you go to your wife and say, I had this thing happen, and I'd like to tell you about it. It's a really hard thing, and Catherine, who I would contend knew me very well, said, "Well, I'm not entirely surprised by this, but I wish you'd made $1 million before you did that." So, um, you know, it, I don't know. Maybe I could have been successful. I might have. I probably would have been deeply unhappy in the end if that's all that there had been. Um, and so making that decision was somewhat difficult because by the time I got approved and made the decision that this is the way I was going to go, I had 3 children. And so, you know, I started, not long after my wife and I had moved to New York and been married. And then we added 2 children. And the process of being evaluated by the Diocese of New York as to whether or not my calling was, in fact, a calling to public ministry. All this was going on. So it took a while. And then, of course, just when I was ready to say, I'm okay now, I'm about to let it go, the ministry's commission said, yeah, we think you're ready. I'm like, oh. And so, yes, I had to deal with those particular issues. And then my wife and I, after I got my approval for a postulancy, which is that level of holy orders where they send you off to seminary and you really start training, my wife and I had to go, well, okay, we have 3 children, we have a mortgage. What do we do now? And one of the ways I do think that callings are often affirmed is by what other things you experience when they happen. So I will tell you, we fortunately were able to keep our home. My wife was able to um, do well enough at what she did and earn enough money that we were completely able to replace um, the income that I had made.
Mm.
And and we were able to stay in the home that we had and pay our mortgage. And we had a wonderful nanny who helped us take care of kids because we started in this home with 2 incomes. And so, living in New York hand to mouth at a higher plane, we needed help. And we did that. And then when I went to seminary, we still were able to do it. And we made it through seminary without taking on additional debt and those sorts of things. So as I experienced that, not only did I experience the blessings of diving into the seminary existence, I experienced the blessings of, oh, I'm really not having to give up all that much.
Mm.
Yeah, there have been times after, my wife left banking as well as me that we have had to be more careful about money and really scratch our heads as to how things would happen, but we were able to make them happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other parts about it were um, that as I did the work of seminarian and priest, I got feedback that I was probably doing the right thing. So that's really an important part is people look for their calling. One of the things I want to warn against is if you do have a spiritual experience in the order of something like you feel like God's talking to you. Now, it's not you hear whispering in your ear, you hear voices in your head, and we can talk about what that might be like, but we have other ways of doing it. But in that sense of calling, not everybody's called to holy orders. And one of the biases in the Episcopal Church is a lot of people think if they've had a deep spiritual experience, that they must be called to be a priest. And I think that we have to overcome that because not everybody's called to be a priest or a deacon, but we are called to serve God and serve our neighbors. And so that's really important. And so, churches need all sorts of people. They need Sunday school teachers. They need people who help out in liturgy, especially in the Episcopal Church. They need people who can help supply the finances of these sorts of things by helping to ask people for pledge money and things like that, so that we can do the work. And you can be a banker and a lawyer, you can be a car mechanic, and you can do all and fulfill those things. And I think the community is far more robust if we get away from a concept of spiritual specialists who wear collars into a place where, well, they've been set aside to do certain kinds of work, but we need the people who live in the world doing the real work of raising children, befriending colleagues and strangers and all that sort of thing in order to help express God's love in the world. So I think, if you do have one of those moments, don't immediately think, oh, I've got to go talk to my priest and go into holy orders. You may want to think, am I called to something else? Am I called to start a new ministry in my church? Am I called to feed the hungry? It's that way.
One of
And
the one of the themes in the Sacred Voices Calling book is that ordinary uh, ordinary life experiences, like being a parent or being a married person, can be suffused with the sacred, and
yes,
that constitutes a calling. And I have to say, I maybe resist that concept a little bit, because the ministerial calling involves, so much discernment and so much sacrifice. Um, I just wonder whether saying, well, everybody has a calling, uh, dilutes that. And I also wonder, like, how do you know the difference between a calling and something that I would do anyway because I enjoy it? Like your friend who read the annual reports, did she do it because she wanted to point out, opportunities for community reinvestment, or did she do it just because that was her thing? She could read a romance novel or an annual report, and she chose annual reports.
well, for her it was, and I know my customers, therefore I can sell them banking products. But so there are a number of things. So I tend to lean into where this book is, and have done so since before I became a priest. Um, the thing that I understand. So there was a question asked me when I went to seminary, and it was this: um, what is your overall sense of what you're about to do? And here's the thing: in the Episcopal Church, like in the Roman Catholic Church, we have this very deeply sacramental life, and priests are deeply involved in that and have been given authority by the church and the bishops to administer sacraments. So Eucharist, baptism, reconciliation, unction, and marriage are all things that we do all the time. And so we see in it, and the thing about all the sacraments is they're either vocational or they are uh, uh, reconciliation type things. They either restore you to a relationship with God, or they are vocational things that you do for God. And we've defined them as sacraments. And Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and maybe the Orthodox, with slight variations, will tell you sacraments are outward and visible signs of God's inward and spiritual grace. And so when you look at the Eucharist, the outward signs are the wine and the bread, but the inward and spiritual grace is the real presence of Christ. When you're talking about baptism, the outward sign is water, but the real inward and spiritual grace is going on inside the person who's being baptized. Same thing's true for marriage. The couple marries each other. The reason the priest is there is to issue the blessing. And the blessing says that something has happened, that when these two people are together, they are sacramental. And so learning and understanding and coming to that sort of place in my spiritual journey, I said, look, what I hope to have happen is that through the sacraments, I'm allowed to uh, perform and distribute. I would love it if the people I'm doing this with would understand that they are to be sacraments in and of themselves. They are to be an outward sign of God's inward spiritual grace. And part of that would be your work that you do. So, growing food, being a farmer, being an auto mechanic, there can be sacramental aspects to any of this work to show God's love, to do it well, to do it with grace, to do it with charity in your heart. All those things are really important. So, what happens for the holy orders, which I think people often confuse, is we get to hold and distribute and deal intimately with holy stuff that the church is defined as holy. But there's all sorts of holy things, moments, traditions, aspects, people who are not defined by the church as holy, but express themselves that way anyway. So I don't think it's a diminishment, but it is a movement against clericalism that only priests or religious specialists get to do that. It is an encouragement to the whole body of people to say, oh, I can participate in that too by being part of that. Yeah.
Would you agree that a person practicing a career, um, in order for it to be suffused with the sacred and come into the realm of a calling, it needs to be somewhat, it needs to meet a need of society, or it needs to meet somebody's need. You can't just be a really good lawyer who makes a bunch of money.
Or just a really good banker. Yeah, I would say that's true. Or just a really good car mechanic and says, look, I can fix your car and I don't really care about the rest of you.
Right.
It's really interesting. So he's not a priest. He doesn't play one on TV. He's actually an economist who's now the president of a college in Israel. It's a fellow named Russ Roberts. And Russ Roberts is a Chicago school economist who, over the past probably 20 years, has moved deeply as becoming a more faithful religious Jew into a place where he understands, oh, economics can be useful and is still useful, and he still believes in markets, but he has a whole podcast called Econ Talk, but most of it's talking about the things that make us feel lovely, how we flourish as human beings. And most of it has to do not with making money or principally being commercial, it has to do with our interactions with each other. I particularly love the show because it's got delightful and they talk about really weird things, and he talks to poets and he talks to people with really odd ideas, and I just thought about that because as I trained as an undergraduate, I really did think more along the lines of normative economics. Just what do we do to make life more efficient? And a lot of what we do in life is not about efficiency or just making money. It's about how we become what we'd like to be. And in the case of a Christian, it would be, well, how do we become who God created us to be? And so that's when your sense of vocation, profession, job becomes more meaningful. And I think we diminish too much by defining simply in terms of the secular life that our jobs are just a way to earn money. And I think it helps people go off on crazy paths. And, you know, I have actually met some amazing lawyers. I have a friend, Kathy Wallman, who's a really amazing person who I think brings her legal background into a place in her life that's really is about sacredness and holiness. And I think that could be applied more and more. I know what the minimum standards for a lawyer are. That's legal ethics,
Mhm.
but do you stop there? And that's really the question. If you're a banker, are you there just to make money on the money that people park with you? Okay, fine, but are you making life better for the people around you?
Right, right. I I embrace that. Well, we're coming up against our self-imposed 30-minute limit, so it's time for the lightning round, David.
Okay.
We get to know David a little bit better. So, first question, favorite baseball team?
Oh, Boston Red Sox.
Not only a good answer, but the correct one too.
Well, I think so. Yes, definitely.
Favorite movie?
Oh my goodness. If Patton.
Patton. Okay. And do you have a favorite churchy movie?
Favorite churchy movie. Um, Dogma.
Wow. That might be an anti-churchy movie.
It's got all sorts of theology packed into it.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I guess we could put it right up there with the invention of lying. With everything.
That's true, and not consuming your alcohol all the way down. You
Right.
need 2 cups.
Right. All
Sure.
right. Well, that will wrap it up for episode 2.
Well, I think
David should have the last word. Go ahead.
well, no, I think we need to flip around this lightning round. So, Kathy Wallman, favorite baseball.
Hello, Boston Red Sox.
Okay, favorite movie.
Um, Terminator, the original.
Good answer. Um, uh, uh, favorite churchy movie.
Favorite churchy movie. I'm torn between Quo Vadis and The Invention of Lying. So, uh,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Um, thank you. I think our folks should know the interlocutors, both of them, and good questions.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll see you next time on episode 3. We'll work on incorporating your very good suggestions, those of you who've been watching, and look forward to sending this out and getting your feedback on this episode too. Over and out. God bless everyone.